No comment about.
Hi everyone, thank you all so much for coming. My name is Catherine. I'm an organizer with Seattle DSA, and I'll be the MC for tonight's event. We're really excited to be here with the organizers of Red May Seattle to close out an incredible month of conversation and art and education. And as Philip said, if you like Red May, if you like learning about the many contradictions of capitalism and learning about the history of anti-capitalist resistance and imagining new ways to fight capitalist oppression, you can go to redmayseattle.org and click on the donate button so we can continue to do this year after year. We also have a table in the back for Seattle DSA if you're interested in learning more about our chapter's work, and I think a Socialist Alternative has a table back there as well. So I'm going to give a brief introduction to the topic and themes of tonight's conversation, which, as you know, is Millennial, Socialism, and the New Working Class. And I'm guessing if you're here, you're interested in socialism and labor organizing, and maybe interested in what the recent upsurge in socialism among millennials means. To answer that question, I think it's important to think about who or what millennials are and what we mean when we talk about generations. We talk a lot about generations as discrete social entities, mostly because they were invented as a marketing concept, invented to sell commodities and to profile consumers. But generations can also be used as a way to serve the interests of capital by displacing class conflicts onto age-related conflicts. So depending on who you ask, millennials are either young people between the ages of 22 and 37, according to official Pew Research guidelines that I looked up today, or we're ruining consumer capitalism for everyone else, or the baby boomers already ruined it for us, and so on. But young people and millennials aren't the architects of neoliberalism or capitalism, and neither are their parents. Economic exploitation isn't something one generation does to another. It's something capitalists in every generation do to everyone else. And one of the things that capitalism is very, very good at is creating and exploiting divisions within the working class in order to strengthen ruling class power. So this is why reactionary rhetoric about millennials always depicts us as a monolith, usually white, always urban, educated, and from at least a middle-class background, entitled, lazy, etc., etc. It's all calibrated to elicit annoyance from the type of person who reads the Wall Street Journal. And I think most of us know that this depiction is far from reality. Millennials are, according to all research, blacker, browner, and poorer than our elders. And while we're more educated than older groups, only about a third of us have bachelor's degrees. Millennials are undocumented, imprisoned, and living without shelter amid the wealth of US cities. There's frequent conversation on the left about the social and working conditions faced by the young, and people speculate that they're new or perhaps fundamentally different than the conditions that our parents and grandparents faced. And I think this is true in some ways. Young workers are more likely to work in unstable jobs and industries, and more likely to contract and freelance. But the working class has been losing ground for decades now, and I think it's more appropriate to think of young workers as the bleeding edge of those trends. And also, these conditions have existed for a long time under capitalism, since its inception, and they still exist in most of the world, where capital is generated through imperialism, war, forced labor, and environmental degradation. And of course, Black and brown people in this country were never afforded the illusory protections of the post-World War II safety net that millennials have had taken from them, supposedly. So I don't think we're really dealing with fundamentally different conditions. The fundamental power structure that we organize against is still the imperialist, white supremacist, capitalist patriarchy, to borrow a phrase from bell hooks. So the work ahead of us is daunting, but I'm also hopeful because I see so much fight and resistance. And I see so many young organizers, some of whom you'll hear from tonight, who recognize the links between capitalist oppression and the systems of racism, imperialism, and patriarchy that both constitute and reinforce it. Black and brown millennials know that the exploitation they face at work is connected to the violence of the police state and the prison industry. Women millennials know that facing sexual harassment or abuse at work is not so different from facing it at home or at school. And we may be facing the same oppressive systems that have been around for a long time, but we also know what can break them. We know that strikes still work. We know that organizing in solidarity with each other, while recognizing that capitalist oppression impacts our communities differently, is still our best hope and our strongest weapon. To quote Silvia Federici, if capitalism has been able to reproduce itself, it is only because of the web of inequalities that it has built into the body of the world proletariat. I would add, if capital must continually create and enforce those divisions, maybe they aren't so stable and natural after all. So think about that the next time you see a headline about entitled Millennials or avocado toast. So without further ado, I'm going to introduce our speakers. We have a really great lineup of organizers who are doing really exciting work here in Seattle. We're going to talk about labor organizing and the future of socialism. And our first speaker is Keaton Slansky, who is the co-chair of Seattle DSA, an organizer and a student at Seattle Central College.
Hello. Good to see you all. Thank you to Catherine for that really brilliant introduction and kind of drawing those links. That's something that I'll be touching more on those themes of a bit later. So, as Catherine said, I'm Keaton Slansky. I'm one of the co-chairs of the Seattle Democratic Socialists of America. I'm really excited to be here with all you comrades tonight here at the end of Red May. And so these last few months, I've kind of been going to a lot of events and giving a lot of speeches about the unique position we occupy in Seattle in 2018, the evils of capitalism and big business and Jeff Bezos, and those are all extremely worthy things to be extremely mad about. But tonight, I wanted to take this opportunity to talk a little more informally about the actual work that our chapter of the Seattle DSA has been doing and the space that DSA occupies in Seattle. So as Catherine so aptly pointed out in her intro, these struggles under capitalism are deeply entrenched with one another. And as socialists in 2018, it is on us to draw those links and combat every form of oppression. So if you had the handout that Shaun was passing out, you'll notice a Kimberly Crenshaw quote in your program, who brilliantly laid the foundation for the theory of intersectionality. Intersectional organizing is no longer and should never have been optional. In Seattle DSA, we strive to make connections between all forms of oppression, knowing that we can't defeat capitalism unless we understand how it relies on racism, sexism, and other forms of exploitation. So Seattle DSA has been working really closely with our South King County branch. Ava is not here, but she's kind of been spearheading that, and she's really amazing. So they've kind of been gearing up to do outreach and listening campaigns to extremely marginalized communities in those areas that have been affected by a rampant housing and displacement crisis. As I'm sure we're all painfully aware, folks are being rapidly priced out of the city, which is a crisis that disproportionately affects our black and brown comrades. Our South King County branch has been door knocking in neighborhoods like Kent and Burien to see what the community needs, how we can help, and what solutions as socialists we can offer them. So in terms of solutions, I like to look to past political and revolutionary organizations. Actually, I'll kind of riff on this for a second. Today I was in the basement of the UW Allen Library to look at their special collections, to look at the KDP, to look at the history of their newspapers. I'm doing a research paper for them. I don't know if you guys are all familiar with the KDP, but they were a revolutionary Filipino-led organization during the 70s who were explicitly Marxist, explicitly revolutionary, and they had the largest chapter here in Seattle, and they were really, really amazing in the work they did, and they opposed the Marcos regime of the Philippines, and they were really, really inspiring, and I would encourage you all to read the book, A Time to Rise. Cindy Domingo is a local labor activist that was the sister of Silme Domingo, a local labor activist who was killed at the old ILWU Union Hall for trying to organize the ILWU against the Marcos regime. So I I think it's really inspiring that we have that kind of history right in our backyard, right? We have that history of revolutionary organizations here. We have past movements to look at. So I like to look to those to kind of, especially as millennials, see how that can inform our future in moving forward in the year 2018, right? And so if you look at the history of these organizations, you will see a rich history of mutual aid programs that can both materially benefit those most marginalized under capitalism and provide a direct challenge to the failures of the state and the capitalist status quo. Another really good example of that is the Seattle Black Panther Party. Their health clinic that they opened here originally is still open in the Central District today. That is proof of the success of these dual power programs. So in Seattle DSA, while we may not have the capacity to open a free health clinic tomorrow or start a free breakfast program, we are working hard to institute a dual power program through kind of the lens of tenant organizing. So I want to speak specifically to that really quickly. Our brilliant comrades in the Housing Justice Working Group, Catherine being one of the key figures in that group, are currently working with tenants in the University District to form a tenants union as a direct challenge to grossly predatory developers known as the American Campus Communities. For those who haven't read it or aren't aware of it, Shaun wrote a really, really good piece for City Arts on this. I believe it's called Where is Home? So you should all check that out to get some more background on how terrible American campus communities are. But so to give you kind of an example, this is a company that comes into university neighborhoods and exploits the student population through any possible means to wring the most profit out of their already obscenely exploitative venture. Some of the complaints leveled against this company include break-ins to individual units, changing of locks. A lot of these students are international students, and it has been potentially reported that they have been stealing immigration documents to potentially get them out of MFTE units to try and get them evicted so they can then raise the rent. And then there was even a potential rumored arson attempt. So they're extremely, extremely bad. So some of the tenants in these buildings have actually already been organizing their neighbors in an extremely militant way without any kind of organizing background, just out of the fact that we are being exploited by this person who has this power, and we are going to knock on our neighbors' doors, and we are going to talk to our neighbors and figure out a way to collectively bargain to change this, which is really, really inspiring. So we have been working with them to try and help them in that effort, and we hope to organize tenants throughout the city with the aim of building militant tenant unions that can fight back against developers and landlords. So doing this is putting into practice the same values that we practice weekly in our workplace organizing collective, which I would encourage everyone to go to. It meets every Wednesday at 7 p.m. at All Pilgrims Church on Capitol Hill. So it's the same concept, right? It's people who are being exploited by a boss or a landlord coming together to figure out how they're being exploited, what they can do about it, map the power in their situation, and how they can fight back against it, right? And at the end of the day, the bosses and the landlords are one person, and we are more than one person. We are many, right? So I think that's pretty inspiring, and yeah, you should all check out the Workplace Organizing Collective. I believe Shaun is going to speak later and can kind of speak to that. So I would guess that our tenant organizing work is relevant to pretty much every renter in the room. And as socialists, I think that some of the most valuable and worthwhile work that we can be doing kind of goes beyond the scope of political education, which is extremely valuable and important, but this puts theory into militant practice, right? So what I've kind of talked about are just two of the things that Seattle DSA has been up to, and I could like literally stand up here all day and be like, here's another thing we're up to. These are the people doing it. This is all the great stuff we're doing all over the city. And like, yeah, I would be here too long, and there are other more experienced, brilliant people to listen to. So just to kind of like rattle some things off so I don't take forever, we were and continue to be a key part of the fight for a head tax on big business. Thanks. Yeah, we thought we had a secure victory there, and there's a referendum fight that's about to go on. John Grant will speak to that a little bit later, but I encourage anyone interested in getting involved in that capacity to reach out to myself or John, or I believe there's a comrade from Working Washington that will speak later to that as well. So we did the tax on big business. We have an immigrant justice group creating a bond fund to get people out of the Northwest Detention Center. We have a communications team who runs our social media. Yeah, no, like that's pretty inspiring. So we have a communications team who runs our social media and puts out the Hellhole. I don't know if y'all have ever read that, but it's pretty good, and you should subscribe to our newsletter so you can get it. We have members canvassing for Medicare for All. We have a political education working group who put on the film series, speaker events, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. The list goes on. The moral of the story here is that we are up to a lot of things, and over the last year we've seen Seattle DSA kind of cement a place in the local political landscape. And honestly, one of the best things about being a socialist is that there's no barrier to entry here, right? Like, we are all here, we are all comrades, and we have, as I just spent a lot of time talking about, we have a lot going on, and we could use everyone's help. We can use all of your help because we are in this struggle together, and we live in this city together. So I mean, it's just like, it's the whole thing of like, you don't need to have read Marx, you don't need to know the names of every communist that's ever lived or died. You just have to have a deeply held belief that something is fundamentally wrong with the capitalist status quo and the drive to build a better world, because really, we could use your help because it's 2018 and things are, you know, where we are in the place we're in. So over the course of 2018, speaking of, we have seen the ugly renaissance of Seattle's right wing come to prominence, and what went from a year in which the, sorry, this is in reference to next year. So this kind of last year, we've seen the rise of the right in Seattle again, right? And so lately there have been all these op-eds about like 2019 is the year that city council is you know, 7 of the 9 people are up for re-election, and we have to take back this center, but I'll get there, but it doesn't make any sense. So 2019 went from a year in which the left potentially fights amongst itself and kind of like maybe elects a moderate progressive or a moderately more progressive or a socialist, to a year in which the left will have to fight to survive. So I'll be honest, most of the city right now is either calling for, like I said earlier, a fictional return to a non-existent center, which is basically a liberal fantasy of some bygone golden age of compromise, which is not only absurd, which is ahistorical. Seattle has historically never been very equitable for anyone besides wealthy white homeowners and business interests, and it is those very forces that we are going to go up against hard next year. So while we have a hand-wringing class of white homeowners scrambling to protect their parking spots and quote-unquote neighborhood character, we have a much more visceral threat coming from their right. Anti-homeless hate groups like Save Seattle have risen to local prominence over this last year, as some of the most vicious anti-homeless voices in the country have been recently seen on Facebook promoting people to report our unhoused neighbors to the police, saying they are armed so that the police will shoot them. And they've encouraged folks to gather signatures for the absurdly titled No Tax on Jobs referendum with local neo-Nazi, Joey Gibson, and his alt-right group, Patriot Prayer. So I think in looking forward in Seattle, like we have a lot to be proud of here, but we still have a lot of work to do, right? So suffice it to say that we're up against a lot. And if the tide of op-eds from our beloved paper of record, the Seattle Times, is any indication, it is going to be a very uphill battle. This is not a fight that DSA will be sitting out. And if you consider yourself on the left in the city, you cannot afford to sit it out either, and I encourage you to join us in this fight. Because as a city, honestly, we deserve better and we need to do better. We do not need a return to the liberal bourgeois status quo politics that got us in this mess in the first place. We need bold demands to meet the immediate needs of those most suffering in this absurdly wealthy city. We do not need to capitulate to business interests. We need to redistribute their wealth. We do not need a city council that quote-unquote gets along. We need a city council that will put the lives and need of its citizens above their own ego. The city deserves a bold left political vision that DSA can and will offer. So if you're concerned about any of these issues I mentioned tonight, and odds are they affect you because we're all here in this room together, there's no reason for you not to join DSA in this fight for a more equitable world, starting here so I don't know if you guys saw, like the reason we have the newsletter called The Hellhole is because Fox News called Seattle a socialist hellhole, and I would posit that this is extremely a neoliberal hellhole. This is in no way a socialist hellhole, but we can get closer to that if we try, right? So we can challenge capital and the establishment through every avenue possible, and we can do it together because there's no better time than now. Thank you. Solidarity.
Thank you, Keaton. Yeah, things are bad in Seattle right now, but we can fight back, which is exciting. Our next speaker is Kaylin Nicholson from Socialist Alternative. She is an organizer. She fought on the 15 Now and Tax Amazon campaigns. Welcome, Kaylin.
Thank you, Catherine. Thank you, Seattle DSA and Red May and everyone who put this event together. Thanks for inviting me to speak, and I apologize. I know it's terrible form to read off a laptop, but I did not have time to print my notes out before I came here today. I think our two speakers so far have done a really good job of laying out both kind of a broad and historical overview of why the millennial generation, my generation, is drawing, the political conclusions it's drawing, and then also a really local focus on some of the ways that those conclusions are being implemented here in Seattle. And I'm going to touch a little bit on both of those scales, I think, the broad and the local. And I think it's always good when we start trying to draw generalizations about how people's ideas are formed and how political movements develop. It's good to start from our own concrete experiences, right? Like, what caused us to draw the conclusions that we drew? What were the formative experiences in our lives that shaped our worldview and led us to the conclusions that we have drawn? And for so many people in my generation, our formative experiences included the foreclosure crisis, in which so many of our parents lost their homes and their life savings. It included just a gutting of funding for public education, where only a slim few were lucky enough to be in public schools that actually had adequate funding for textbooks and teachers and even keeping buildings in repair. When we graduated from public school and tried to go to university, we were faced with completely unaffordable tuition, where if we actually wanted to get a degree, we were forced to take out an amount of debt that, as a 17-year-old, I think should be illegal for you to actually sign your name to take out, because it condemns you to a lifetime of attempting to repay that debt. And then if you're lucky enough to get to go to school, to higher education and graduate, you're faced with a job market where even with a degree, it's very difficult to get anything more than a minimum wage job. And a minimum wage job is barely even enough to pay rent in most urban areas where you can actually get jobs, let alone repay that mountain of student debt that you have hanging over your head, let alone try to save to make a down payment for a mortgage for $1 million house, which is close to what the median home price is right now in Seattle. So, and this is the situation for folks like me who grew up middle class, right? For the majority of people, it's far worse than that. For the majority of people, college is not an option, right? Owning a home is a dream. But what we've seen in the last 20 years is an acceleration of the hollowing out of the middle class with these advantages, these benefits like affordable college tuition, affordable home ownership, decent public education, affordable healthcare, these things that previous generations fought extremely hard for and sacrificed for. Those gains are being taken away from us. And that's not an accident. That doesn't just happen because one or another individual CEO is greedy. The whole system of capitalism depends on being able to constantly increase the rate of profit, right? It's not enough to just make a profit. You have to make a higher profit than all of your competitors. You have to be increasing the rate of return. And the only way to do that is to constantly be chipping away at the wealth that the working class has been able to carve out for itself. So any victory that previous generations have won, things like the weekend, things like the 40-hour work week, things like a minimum wage that is actually a living wage, or decent, high-quality public education. Our predecessors fought and won these victories and thought that they had created a decent quality of life for working-class people going forward under capitalism. But what they failed to recognize is that capitalism doesn't actually just sit back and accept, all right, you guys have won, we fought a good fight, shake hands, this is where we are now. That's not how that system works. They will constantly be trying to claw back every little piece of comfort, every little piece of wealth that we manage to win. And that's why ultimately it's not enough to fight just for this reform or that reform. It's not enough to fight just to increase the minimum wage or just to win a tax on big business to fund affordable housing. Because even if and when we do win those victories, they are at risk and they will be taken away from us the minute we let our guard down. Ultimately, what we need to be fighting for is a completely different system, a different way of organizing the economy, where our wealth and our productive resources are owned in common and controlled democratically by and for the 99% rather than by and for the 1%. And I think one of the reasons why so many millennials are drawing this conclusion that a different system is necessary is that the staggering inequality that you see in the world today is higher than at literally any other point in human history, right? We have 7 individuals who own as much wealth as the bottom half of the world's population. Okay? These are numbers that we can't even wrap our heads around. They're so staggering. But one thing is clear. The resources exist in our world to meet the needs of the human population. They're just not being distributed correctly. But the wealth is there. The resources are there. Companies like Amazon are making record profits. Jeff Bezos just became the first individual person to have over $100 billion of net worth personally, just for himself. He could single-handedly, if he wanted to, end homelessness in the United States many times over with his personal fortune. So that level of inequality, it's impossible to see that, to see the headlines about corporate profits, about Jeff Bezos' wealth, and then to reflect on our own experiences of being unable to afford health care, unable to afford housing, and to not draw the conclusion that there was something fundamentally wrong with this system and that there has to be a better way of organizing and distributing our resources. But just drawing that simple conclusion does not necessarily lead you to an understanding of how to make that happen, right? And I think a lot of millennials, and myself included for a long time, end up in a stage of life where they feel very demoralized and depressed because you see this unnecessary suffering all around you in the world, and you know that us, even all of the experiences that I laid out, the formative experiences for me that drew me to socialist conclusions, I'm still amongst the top, few privileged percent when you look at the global population in terms of quality of life, right? And that amount, that sheer volume of unnecessary human suffering is overwhelming. And when you think about the forces and the powers that are arrayed against us, giant multinational corporations with hundreds of billions of dollars in their bank accounts, entire political parties that control our whole economic system, it's extremely demoralizing. And you think, well, how can I, as one individual person, or even just the people that I know in my community, who are we in the face of these massive global powers that have the resources of the world at their disposal? And I didn't know what a union was until I was an adult. Not in a real way. I'd heard the word before, but I didn't really know what it meant because I didn't know anyone who was a member of a union. Because where I grew up, and for many people, union density is so low that most of us don't have a parent who was a member of a union and didn't grow up knowing that it's possible for workers to come together and take collective action to demand higher wages, to demand fair working conditions, to fight back against the attacks of their bosses. That wasn't something that I was even familiar with as a concept when I was growing up, because of the historically low levels of union density and of organization on the left over this past period. And in particular, I think, for me growing up, as far as I was concerned, there were only 2 political parties. And if you were a Democrat, you were a good person, and if you were a Republican, you were a bad person. That's what I was taught growing up. But what I realized as I started to ask these questions about why is the world so unequal, and why has our political and economic system failed so spectacularly, I realized that in fact both of these parties, both the Democrats and the Republicans, are bankrolled by the same major corporations whose lobbyists are setting the economic policy for our entire country. And that's also a really demoralizing experience. So wait a second, the one avenue where I've been told I can make some change, right? I can go and vote, I can do my patriotic duty, I can make my voice heard, I can try and change things. Well, what option is that really? What change can you really affect if the only 2 options in front of you fundamentally are representing the exact same interests who are diametrically opposed to you and your interests? But the hopeful part of this is that this is all starting to change, and there is a massive awakening to the realization that there is no sort of natural law that says there can only be 2 political parties and that all political parties have to be bankrolled by major corporations. And there's been a huge resurgence in support for the idea of a third party and for the idea of independent politics and for the idea of unions and organized labor and working class people getting organized on an independent class basis to fight for our own needs and our own interests. And as Keaton said, people have come to these conclusions primarily not by reading Marx, not by studying the Spanish Civil War, but through their own lived experiences. And right here in Seattle, we've had some lived experiences over the past 5 years that have really driven these lessons home in a very real way. In particular, the lesson that the way to fight back and win the basic resources that we need to win the money that we need to fund housing, to fund healthcare, to fund education, and the political power that we need to be able to actually have a say over how our communities are run. The way to win those victories is to unite the broadest possible layers of our community on a class basis around common demands that matter to all of us. And there are a lot of those demands, right? Things like winning more funding from big business for affordable housing. This is an issue that affects 99% of the residents of Seattle, right? Parents, students, communities of color, immigrants, women, retirees, indigenous communities, all of these groups have a particular interest, aside from just their general interest as members of the working class, a particular interest in desperately needing access to safe and affordable housing. And so we can build extremely broad, strong coalitions that draw all of these different communities and groups together around a common demand that is in all of our interests, and we can use all of our different perspectives and all of our different experiences to build a rich and strong and vibrant movement that can stand up to Amazon, one of the most powerful corporations in the entire world, that can stand up to Jeff Bezos, the richest man in the entire world, and say, no, you do not get to tell us what our communities look like. You do not get to threaten to take our livelihoods and jobs away when we have the audacity to demand that you pay something towards alleviating the housing crisis that you have created in our community. And when you do that, when you organize on that basis, you can win, even against the most powerful man in the world. And that's a lesson we learned just less than a month ago. And as Keaton said, that victory that we were able to win after months and months of tireless organizing and campaigning by countless different communities and organizations coming together, that victory is already under threat. As soon as the city council passed the Amazon tax, immediately Amazon and Starbucks and Vulcan, they all got together, they threw some money, to them just absolutely pocket change, into a pot, and they hired all of these canvassers, you know, poor working class folks from all over the country who desperately need a job. They flew them into Seattle. They're paying them $3 a signature, and they told them, go out and get signatures on this petition to overturn the tax. And it's up to us to defend our victory. We sacrificed, many people in this room, I recognize you because I met you in the tax Amazon struggle. We invested so much time and so much energy to fight for what is in reality $50 million a year over 5 years. To us, that's a ton of money, right? That's hundreds of families, thousands of people who will be housed versus not housed, right? That's huge. But to Amazon and these big corporations, it's nothing. It's pocket change. But still, they can't stand to have a precedent set that says working people, when they come together on a united basis, they can stand up to you and say no, and they can have their way. They cannot stand that precedent be set, because they know, just like we know, that if it happens in one city, that people in other cities who are also facing housing crises, who are also facing crises of lack of funding for social services and health care, that they will say, oh wait, if they were able to do that in Seattle, maybe we can do that here. And that precedent will spread, and other cities will start getting organized on broad, class-based coalitions and movements, and will start demanding that big business start paying their fair share and paying back into the communities that the workers that provide their profits come from in the first place. And that is already happening, in fact. There have been over 50 local elected representatives from around the country have signed on to a letter that they sent to the Seattle City Council saying, thank you for passing this tax, thank you for setting this precedent, this is what our city needs, this is what our community needs, you showed it's possible, you provided the blueprints. And we want that to happen. We want this movement to spread. But if Amazon and Starbucks and Vulcan succeed in overturning our victory, what precedent does that set? That sets the precedent that when working people come together and stand up to fight for their rights, that no matter how hard you fight, no matter how much you sacrifice, Jeff Bezos and Amazon are bigger and stronger, and they will smack you back down. So you might as well just sit down quietly and take what you can get, right? And are we going to accept that precedent? No. Hell no. So this summer, we have a lot of work to do, my friends. Keaton talked about a lot of awesome work that DSA is involved in. Socialist Alternative is going to be laser focused on defending the Amazon tax that we fought so hard to win earlier this year. And right now, the effort to overturn the tax, they're in the stage of gathering signatures to get their referendum on the ballot in the fall. Now, if they fail to get enough signatures to get that referendum on the ballot, then it's dead in the water. Their effort to overturn is dead in the water. If they do get those signatures, then it's a much harder fight. Then we have to actually run a full campaign to try to answer all of their lies and all of their threats about how the tax will destroy jobs. We'll have to fight that all the way through to November, and that'll be expensive and that'll be time-consuming. But if we can prevent them from even getting it on the ballot, then we can nip that in the bud, and we can move on to fighting for bigger and better things that we still very, very desperately need in our communities, like rent control, like no new youth jail, like community oversight over the police, and all of these other things we need. So I appeal to all of you, get active in the effort to defend this tax that we won, this victory, this flag that we planted in the sand against Jeff Bezos, against Amazon, the most powerful capitalists in the world. We have to set a precedent. We have to be an example for the rest of the country to follow. On Saturday at 6 o'clock at Vermilion, Socialist Alternative is hosting a victory/defense party to celebrate the tax that we won and to train people to go out and confront these petition signature collectors who are trying to collect signatures for the petition to overturn the EHT. We know that they are using lies to convince people to sign this petition, because the actual arguments, Jeff Bezos doesn't want to have to pay pocket change to help solve the crisis of homelessness. That's not actually a convincing argument to get working people to sign a petition. So instead they're saying things like small businesses all over Seattle are already closing because of this tax. That's an outright lie. This tax does not apply to any except the top 3% of corporations in Seattle, and it's not in effect yet. So they're using countless lies. We already have them recorded on record telling these lies. And all we need to do is go out there wherever they are, in front of grocery stores, in front of libraries, at Green Lake, high traffic footpath areas. They have until June 14th to collect enough signatures to get their referendum on the ballot to overturn all of the hard work that we did this past year. We have until June 14th to stop them from doing that. And all that means is we have to go wherever we see them, we have to go where they are, and we have to bring our own petition. It's a decline to sign petition that SEIU put together, and we need to tell people the real facts. We need to point out the lies that these signature gatherers are telling, and we need to tell people, if you care about affordable housing, if you want to tax the billionaires and Jeff Bezos and to have an actual affordable city that working people can live in, this is the petition you want to sign, not that petition. We're going to be training people on how to do that, how to go out with those petitions and stop the signature gatherers from collecting signatures on Saturday at 6 o'clock in Vermilion. I hope everyone is there, and if they do succeed in getting this referendum on the ballot, then I hope everyone is ready to dig deep and dig in for a 6-month campaign to educate people door to door in every working class neighborhood in Seattle on the reality of the lies that they are spreading to try to overturn this tax, so that we can set a precedent of working people being able to come together and stand up against the richest man in the world and win funding for desperately needed affordable housing, because housing should be a human right.
Thank you so much, Kaylin. I really appreciated what you said about our politics emerging out of the circumstances of our material lives. It's really important, and it's one of the things that I think about a lot as an organizer, is how we connect our individual experiences to other people's experiences so that we can build a collective understanding of our shared struggle. So thank you for that. Our next speaker probably needs no introduction to a group of Seattle leftists, but I'm going to do it anyway. It'll be John Grant, former Socialist City Council candidate, former director of the Washington State Tenants Union, and affordable housing organizer.
Hi, everybody. How y'all doing tonight? Good. That was kind of, lukewarm. How are y'all doing tonight? All right, that's better. So I'm here on behalf of Bring Seattle Home / the effort to stop the repeal of the big business tax. Now, Kaylin took all the words out of my mouth, so I'm not going to go for too long because you just heard a lot about it. I want to emphasize a couple of points. So I don't know if y'all heard, but the one-night count that catalogs how many homeless folks are out there just came out today. We went from having 11,000 people out in the streets in the cold to 12,000 people. The numbers keep going up. And we keep being told, well, gosh, I wish we could do something about that, but... Well, we did do something about that, right? We taxed the biggest corporation in the world, one of the wealthiest individuals in the world, to address this problem. And what are they doing? They're clawing back every single penny. And that's what this repeal effort is about. Did you know that Jeff Bezos spends, and knowing the room, you probably do know this, Jeff Bezos spends $1 billion of his own wealth every year for space travel? I mean, that's an interesting set of priorities. This tax would be 0.02% of that a year. That's what we're asking for. It is a reasonable tax. And in fact, we know that we need so much more. Now, we have until the 14th to try to stop this from moving forward. That means that we need to go out there and educate the public. There are petitioners out there that are selling just flat lies about this tax, that this is a tax on people's jobs, that employees are going to have to pay it, that every business pays it, when in fact it's just companies that make over $20 million a year, and it is only going to impact the top 3% of businesses in Seattle. This has the opportunity to house, over 10 years, thousands of people off our streets. It is our one opportunity to take local action to do something real. So I am running out of time, so I'm going to be real quick. I have two asks for you. The first is that if you haven't gotten this flyer from me, it's a half sheet. This is a phone number and an email or a phone number that you can text or call if you see a petitioner. We're trying to find where locations are at, and if you see somebody, let us know. We're trying to find where these locations are so that we can deploy people who are educating the public about what this petition is actually going to do, which is going to repeal $48 million worth of money to go towards homelessness. This is not a jobs tax. This is stealing $48 million away to address our homelessness crisis. So if you haven't gotten one, I will hand these out to you. The second thing, and this is actually more important, is that I have a sign-in sheet to volunteer to be those educators. We've found over 100 locations about where these petitioners are at, but we need more people between now, like today, and the 14th. We've got less than 2 weeks to pull this off, to go and send people to those locations and hand out flyers with information about what the truth is about this tax, right? So I'm encouraging you, and I'm almost pleading with you to sign up and help educate the public. I'm going out this weekend. Many other people are going out as well. We have a whole network of folks who are scouting these locations. You'll get a text message on your phone that's like, show up on such and such intersection in front of Safeway, and then that's how we're going to be able to stop this thing from hurting our community, because we know that what this repeal effort is about. It's about greed, it's about income inequality, and we need to organize and mobilize so that we don't let Jeff Bezos win. All right, everybody, I'm going to hand this out, let it circulate. I know there's a lot of gaps, so if you could just pass it on to the next row and sign up, that would be great. And also, I need to mention, if you can't make it to the 6 p.m. Socialist Alternative event, there is also going to be a training at 2 p.m. on Saturday. It does basically the same thing. You can go to either one. Please show up to the training. It's important if you're going to be signing up and getting out there to spread the word. Okay, everybody? All right, thank you.
Thank you, John. Our next speaker is Jonathan Rosenblum, who is a writer and union and community organizer in Seattle. He's the author of Beyond 15, Immigrant Workers, Faith Activists, and the Revival of the Labor Movement, and is a member of the National Writers Union, UAW 1981. He currently works with Shama Sawant in her city council office, and also with UAW 4121, which you may sound familiar to some of you since they are striking very soon. It's very exciting. Let's the Union of Academic Student Employees at the University of Washington. So welcome, Jonathan.
Thanks very much. It's great to be in a hall I've spent a lot of time in over many years. It could use a little bit more red. You bring some more of the flags next time. And I'm joined here by my union sibling, Michelle Tichalar, who's a climate scientist at the University of Washington and one of the lead organizers in the campaign. Just concluded the successful campaign to win union recognition for 1,100 postdoctoral researchers at the University of Washington. We're going to get to hear from Michelle and some of the militant actions that postdocs took to win union recognition. First, I'm going to talk a little bit about the experience of CTAC, which I was privileged to be part of the first successful $15 fight in the country. And we're going to have our colleague Yasmin Aden join us. She was also, along with me, one of the leads on the CTAC campaign. She got called away to an emergency union meeting this evening and couldn't make it. So in the time that we have, we want to talk about two themes about union organizing today that we're seeing around the country, but also here locally. The themes of power and the theme of disruption that I think are essential to building a powerful new labor movement. The first one about power is that we have to recognize that our fight is not just about winning stuff. It's about confronting the 1% and building our own power to demand the vision that we have of a just society, as you heard from Keaton and from Kalin. For example, the Fight for 15. How many people have been involved in the Fight for 15 here? So give yourselves a hand, because in the last 5 years, through that fight, 21 million people have won raises totaling $62 billion. That is a lot of money. But we have to put that in perspective. The $62 billion, compare that to the Trump tax cuts of last December that gave $1.2 trillion in tax breaks to the 1%, offsetting by a factor of 20 everything that we fought for and won in the Fight for 15 in the last 5 years. Now, that's not to diminish the work that we all did in the streets and in various places around this country and elsewhere, but it's to put it into perspective. As welcome as the fight against income inequality is, as much as we admire the bravery and success of fast food workers, retail workers, airport workers, and others who have led this fight, and as much as raising wages relieves soul-crushing poverty while inspiring people to take direct action, it's an inadequate vision for those invested in building a just society. It's treating a fever with aspirin without going after the underlying disease. And that's because at the root, as we know in this meeting, the problem we face isn't income inequality, it's the power inequality that we have under capitalism. So in union organizing, we have to center the task of building powerful working class organizations. And we can talk more about that as we go along. The second theme, though, I want to just lift up here is disruption. The laws, rules, and customs that are enacted by the political and economic elites that we have are intentionally designed to maintain their power over us. And I think that's sort of known amongst us here, but there's sisters and brothers and other union siblings who we need to work with to get them to understand that. Sometimes we hear allies in the labor movement say things like, for workers, labor law is broken. Anybody heard that before? Labor law is broken, and I disagree. U.S. labor law is not broken. It's working precisely as the political establishment intended it to. So if we want change, we have to be ready to disrupt the status quo. And we look at these inspiring examples of recent months, West Virginia teachers going on strike, Arizona teachers going on strike. Those were disruptive, not just because they disrupted the flow of commerce, the flow of work, the flow of what was supposed to be going on in those schools and those communities. They were disruptive because they were illegal actions under capitalist law. It's not just strikes, though, that we need to think about when we think about disruption, because disruption happens in smaller ways as well. And I want to tell a couple quick stories. In SeaTac, it was a group of almost exclusively immigrant workers, baggage handlers, cabin cleaners, wheelchair attendants, aircraft fuelers, who were, for all intents and purposes, legally denied the right to organize unions at SeaTac, so that we knew for workers to succeed in this environment, to build powerful unions, to win pay that was a living wage, to secure rights on the job, we needed to circumvent the laws, and in fact, we needed to break the laws. The strategy of disruption showed up in tactical ways, in ticket counter sit-ins, marches through the terminal, management office occupations by the workers, a strike vote by fuelers, and in big ways, like by going to the voters with our $15 initiative when the airport bosses refused to sit down and bargain with us. I want to share one brief story of the disruption because it speaks to the creativity and imagination of workers and allies. And I would just note that it's a story that's in the book, which is available tonight after we're done here over here. 25% of all sales proceeds tonight go to Seattle DSA, so buy as many as you can for your friends. But this one story that I tell about, I think, captures a lot about what we mean by disruption at even a tactical level. Now, most of you probably know Alaska Airlines is the dominant airline at SeaTac Airport, so they were a prime target for us as we prepared to head to the ballot to win 15. Now, in May of 2013, 6 months before the ballot, we had about 80 of our folks attend the Alaska Airlines shareholders meeting, the annual shareholders meeting. This was workers, clergy, community supporters, union members who had bought shares of Alaska stock in the months leading up to the meeting. We're all owners of Alaska Airlines, just one share, but we're owners, right? There were about 200, 220 people in the room, so we were actually a pretty substantial force. Now, about 5 minutes before the meeting was supposed to begin and the CEO was going to stand up and talk about how profitable and wonderful the company was, a dozen ministers stood up in front of the auditorium and they held hands. They were led by the Reverend John Helmier. Some of you may know him. He's at the Hillman City Collaboratory. He's 6'7", so he commands attention. And he said, "I've been asked by some of the shareholders to open with a prayer." The room fell silent. The ministers were so deft about it, some of the executives thought it was part of the program. One of my colleagues from Working Washington was shuffling some papers in the aisle, and an Alaska executive turned to him and said, "Shh, they're doing the prayer now." Reverend Helmier began. He said, "God of mercy, God of justice, God who transforms our hearts, we give thanks for the privileges and powers that we have been given." The crowd was now drawn in, and Helmier swung the prayer sharply to the left. He said, "God, we ask that you give our leaders the wisdom to do right by their workers, to do right by their community. Guard us from the gravity of greed. Save us from the snares of selfishness. And help us to live your eternal truth that we belong to you and to one another." The ministers returned to their seats. The corporate executives sat stunned for a moment, perhaps still not quite comprehending how their meeting, their annual showcase of the company's control and power and finesse, had just been hijacked and in the most unexpected of ways. Now, the prayer set the tone for within the meeting. In issuing their prayer, the clergy were connecting material demands to spiritual values, shifting the debate from dollars and cents to basic fundamental questions of justice. And their act of sheer chutzpah emboldened workers and the rest of us. Throughout the rest of the meeting, over the next hour, workers and allies interrupted the executives with demands, chants, a spiritual song for airport worker justice. And I left the meeting with two thoughts. First, since I'm an organizer, my first thought was, boy, did we ever fuck up that meeting. It really was a wreck. And the second thought, since I'm a person of faith, was, wow, that was a profoundly spiritual experience. To go into the home of corporate executives to challenge their moral bearings in the way we did was a powerful assertion of our demands that we were standing up not just for better pay, but for the right of people to live with dignity. Indeed, in numerous meetings and marches through the airport, we saw workers gain confidence when they marched with clergy, when they engaged in this disruption, when they learned through the experience that you can actually disrupt and not only get away with it, but you can show your power and make the bosses cower. We disrupted the political establishment's narrative about how the airport economy works, and we turned the debate into not just a political question, but a moral question about what justice means in our society. So as we plan the fights immediately in front of us, the fight for a contract for academic student employees at the University of Washington, picket lines going up this Saturday morning, the fight to stop the big business rollbacks of funding for affordable housing, as we've heard just now, we need to recognize that these all are fundamentally struggles over power, not just the immediate issue at hand. And we must recognize that the disruptive strategies for workers, whether in West Virginia or SeaTac, are essential given the capitalist legal environment, and also essential because they reframe the fight to fundamental questions about how society ought to be organized. Thanks very much. And now, Michelle, and I have to just say, in introducing you, the word postdoc and militant don't normally appear in the same sentence together, but what I've learned in the last couple months is they absolutely go together. And it's a tremendously inspiring story to hear about this fight, the successful fight that isn't over, of course, because as we just heard, the bosses always fight back. But we're going to fight back even stronger. Michelle.
Thank you, Jonathan. I like to joke that as a female immigrant labor organizing climate scientist, I must be America's favorite demographic at this moment, but I think that sort of fails to underscore just how lucky I feel to be able to do this work and how excited I am to get to talk to you tonight. So, as Jonathan says, I am a postdoc and a union organizer at the University of Washington, and I'm here to share with you the unlikely story of how UW postdocs won the right for collective bargaining. Now, our story is unlikely, first of all, because you may not think of postdocs as being workers who need to be in a union. You may even wonder what a postdoc is. A postdoc is a person who has gotten a doctoral degree and is currently doing mentored research and typically is working to become a professor at some point in the future. And so we are well educated. You may think of us as extremely privileged. And we work for institutions that are typically thought of as liberal and also serving the greater good. But in the power hierarchy of the university, postdocs are near the bottom. And in talking with hundreds of our colleagues, we found that the need for collective bargaining is strong. We encountered so many stories of sexual harassment, pregnancy discrimination, unjust firings, 80-hour work weeks, denied health care, and single-parent postdocs paying one half of their salary on rent and the other half of their salary on childcare. So our working conditions become a question of who gets to do science, and as such, who gets to create the knowledge that sort of forms the foundation of our society and our policy. And I'll throw in a little side note here, which is that where I'm from, which is the Netherlands, all public sector employees have a collective bargaining agreement that is negotiated at the national level. And so we may envision a future where it's not necessary to justify that we deserve equitable working conditions, regardless, or just for our specific group of workers, but may actually think of this as normal and something that is a fundamental right for all. But that's an aside. Our story is also unlikely because of the personality traits of postdocs and what it took to get to this victory. So postdocs, as you may imagine, are self-determined, very independent, and we work in very isolated work environments. Some of us may not even like talking to each other. And having been in school for at least 2 decades and succeeded in that system, we are people who are good at playing by the rules and also believe that the system works to serve us. Winning the right to collective bargaining took challenging all of these characteristics. So to start a union, you first have to show a certain level of interest amongst the workers, and then you get to hold an election in which the majority needs to vote union yes. And to get through this process, we couldn't just send out a bunch of emails or tap into whatever digital communication networks we usually rely on. It involved dozens of postdocs talking in person with hundreds of other postdocs, listening to their concerns, and one by one building the connections that form what is now our network of postdoc relationships. And it also involved breaking the rules. So the rules say that if we show 30% interest, the State Labor Commission will grant us an election. But the university found ways to stall this process for months. They would send in wrong lists of employees. They started claiming that certain groups of postdocs should not be in our union, and we were sent down rabbit holes of hearings and briefings and testimony and weeks of waiting, all of which seemingly followed the rules. Until finally, we had enough. We decided it was time for the university to give us our rightful union election. So to do this, we had to take action together. Sending letters to the Labor Commission or to the university administration was simply not enough. We planned to do together what we like to do best on our own, which is silence, and we planned to do that in the university's president's office. So on March 14th, 200 postdocs and our allies marched on the president's office. In one hand, we had our picket signs. In the other hand, we had our laptops ready to do work. And we told the president that we wouldn't leave until we got our election. And this was just such a magical, empowering moment of community and purpose and joy and collective power. Postdocs who are typically so focused on their own careers decided to take time out of their day to come together and chant and show the powers that be just how strong we are collectively. And after months and months of stalling, the next morning, the university announced that our election could proceed unhindered. And so, as such, this action gave enormous energy to our campaign. Earlier this month, we won our union election with unprecedented turnout and an overwhelming majority of postdocs voting yes to join our union. And at this work-in, we had more postdocs in one room than have possibly ever been in a room together. We showed the university that we are ready to change the status quo, but most importantly, and I think most relevantly to people in this room, we showed ourselves and academic workers across the country that when we come together and collectively challenge the rules, we win. Thanks so much, Jonathan and Michelle. It's a really exciting story. The grad student workers are about to strike, because their strike started on Saturday, is that right? Yeah, they're striking for 2 weeks during the finals period. So if you can show up to picket lines and support them, that would be awesome. Our next speaker is Sydney Chun. She is an organizer with Working Washington and works with the Seattle Domestic Workers Alliance. Welcome, Sydney.
Hi, everyone. Thank you for all of those fantastic speeches. Catherine, I love that you had said strikes still work. Workers need those protections to do so. Keaton, I like that you said we need to look at past revolutionary models to build on. Kaylin, I love that you said minimum wage jobs that don't pay enough, make ends meet, or millennials have to deal with minimum wage jobs that don't pay enough to make ends meet in the city. I've lived through that. And unions will provide collective voices to improve working conditions and wages. Seattle leads on progressive policies that trend nationwide. And Jonathan, I love that. He said we should not only just win campaigns, but hold the 1% accountable when we do so. I love those themes, and Work in Washington likes to do that with each campaign we run. Who's heard of Work in Washington? Can you raise your hand? Woo! That's a lot of people. What about the Seattle Domestic Workers Campaign? Okay, cool. So not enough hands. So Work in Washington is led along with coalition partners here in this room. We've led on Fight for 15, secure scheduling, holding corporations accountable, paid family leave, corporate responsibility through employee hours tax, which is the head tax, and now wage boards. Who's heard of wage boards? Okay, cool. We're creating regional sectoral bargaining opportunities for workers who don't have federal, state, or local protections. So the Domestic Workers Campaign is pretty fun. We've been organizing for about a year. Who knows what a domestic worker is? Let's start with that. Okay, so it's anyone who works within the home, typically nannies, house cleaners, gardeners, cooks, and home care workers who are cash paid. And they can be directly employed by the employer itself or through an agency. And so currently they don't have federal protections. Seattle has we're progressive, so they provide protections such as minimum wage, overtime for most full-time and part-time domestic workers, but we need to bring everyone into the fold. So that means full-time, part-time, casual, and live-in. And we think there's about 30,000 domestic workers who don't have those rights. So we're fighting for it at the city level. Isn't that exciting? Yeah. Woo! So the big picture about this campaign is, the future of our economy and democracy is dependent upon revitalizing our middle class. When there's 30,000 workers who don't have protections, that's a problem, right? So we have an opportunity to lead on with this campaign, to lead on building worker power to support that trend. When workers can negotiate as a group to collectively bargain with employers on creating higher standards in their industries, we can potentially raise wages, reduce economic inequality in their industries, and grow our local economy. So we think wage boards can provide a place for workers like domestic workers and future workers that we might need to look at, who have traditionally been carved out of the law to bargain collectively. So we think it's an important step to democratizing the workplace, and it's kind of democratizing or modernizing the collective bargaining process. So what power will that create, as Jonathan kept talking about? So that power, where workers have direct line to negotiate with employers, that's collective power right there, to negotiate for better working conditions. And we think that this wage board and worker senators like Casa Latina and Work in Washington can help deliver that for workers. So we're seeking to pass scalable, groundbreaking labor law that would give tens of thousands of workers exercising their collective voice with their employers through this thing called Domestic Workers Standards Board. So look for that. Legislation is going to be introduced June 21st. Woo! So the way it works is when workers come to worker centers, they can become representatives of their industry. So we can have nanny representatives, house cleaner representatives, whoever wants to be represented. They can elect their folks to be representatives on the wage board, along with employers who also have to go through employer associations to get representation. And then along with public officials, they meet monthly and figure out what should we tackle, and then they figure out that process in a 1 to 2 year period, hand it over to city council to vote yes or no, typically a down vote, so then they just have power to not throw it back at them, but just to say yes or no. And so that's really exciting because we're looking to push healthcare through, retirement, portable benefits accounts, all of the fun things that workers don't currently have and need to live in the city through this wage board process. But the wage board won't work if there's no coordination with worker centers organizing them, right? So Work in Washington has been organizing domestic workers like nannies and home care workers in Casa Latina with house cleaners over the last year, and we've talked to at least 1,000 of them, learning hundreds of issues that they have. And so they're really excited about the idea of having baseline protections through a Bill of Rights, which is minimum wage protection, harassment or protection from harassment and discrimination protection, overtime, workers' comp, and the ability to have a contract with an employer. But then the wage board helps them create other higher standards, as you all heard, so they can get secure scheduling and everything else we all have. So we're really excited about that, where workers have kind of like a collective voice with Work in Washington and a home and an association to come to. And so we hope that this is scalable, and we've had a couple cities already try to replicate it in theirs, and we're like, just wait, let's see what happens. And so it's exciting to see that it's going to hopefully start to become a national trend, if not just a regional one. So worker centers like Work in Washington have the opportunity to lead on passing groundbreaking legislation, as we have with Fight for 15, secure scheduling, head tax, and now the wage board to improve workers' rights, wages, and working conditions. So join us with the head tax opportunities that everyone's mentioned here today. We're working along with SEIU on that, domestic workers, and then future campaigns. Thanks, guys.
Thank you, Sydney. I think it's really interesting to hear both the talks about the postdoc student organizing and the domestic worker organizing, that we are engaged in these struggles with sectors that are not historically organized at all, and that engage in types of work like knowledge work and care work that we don't usually think of when we think of unionized labor forces, and we think of men in hard hats or something. But these are very different workers, and they are the working class. So it's really exciting to hear about these campaigns. Speaking of labor organizing, our next speaker is a representative of the Seattle DSA Labor Committee. His name is Shaun Butterfield, and he's going to talk to us about the work that the DSA Labor Committee does. They have a really, really awesome workplace organizing collective that meets weekly on Capitol Hill and is kind of an open forum workshop for anyone who is interested in organizing their workplace. So if you have a boss or wish to have one, or you know someone who has a boss, you can probably learn something from workplace organizing. It's really awesome. So Shaun is going to talk more about that, and we have some exciting campaigns that have grown out of those weekly meetings that we have.
Hi everyone, my name is Shaun. I'm a little tired tonight. I just spent all day at work, so forgive me. I do want to talk about the Workplace Organizing Collective, but first I want to talk just a little bit about our own unionizing struggle at the blood bank. So I work for Bloodworks Northwest, which is the regional blood center. We supply blood, at least 800 units of whole blood, all up and down Western Washington, and that's what keeps our community alive. So we do a pretty important job. We don't wear hard hats, but we are definitely working class. I make $18.69 right now, which is more than a lot of the folks that I work with make. And I live in Seattle, and I could only afford to do that because I live in Capitol Hill housing, it's affordable housing, and without that, there's no way I could live in the city of Seattle unless I had like 6 roommates. I guess I want to talk about my experience of organizing, or trying to organize this union at Bloodworks. So the theme of tonight is millennials and socialism, and so I'll say that most of my coworkers are millennials like myself, and I really feel like we are a generation that really has spent a lot of time, or has spent no time at any point in our lives where labor was ascendant, where labor was powerful, right? And so for most of us, like our postdoc friend over here, may not even have known what a union, or no, I'm sorry, yep, that was you. So, we, didn't even know what a union was, right? Or had some idea, but no idea that what it actually means is workers standing together to demand things. And it's a pretty simple idea, right? We stand together, they can't single us out individually, therefore we have power as a group. If we threaten to withhold our labor, we can get the things that will make the conditions of our labor better, right? I mean, you clap, but that is not a revolutionary idea, right? That's nuts and bolts, right? And I mean, that's part of what I'm trying to convince the people that I'm organizing about. This is not anything highfalutin, right? This is, I come from Virginia. And, just real down-to-earth shit. Just real simple stuff. So I think I just want to share a couple of observations that I've made, that stuff that I've learned doing this. One is that people have seriously internalized the idea that their place in the economy is like natural and right, and is the result of, this invisible hand, right? And like where they are in the world as a result of their either ability and drive and, success at doing what they do best and serving the market or whatever, or their failure to do so. And that's really demoralizing if you can barely afford to live in the city who you literally help keep alive. Right? The same people that are going to take this blood in the hospital are the ones who are saying, I'm sorry, I don't care that you can't live here. That's seriously demoralizing for the people that I work with. And the second thing is, it really takes a little bit of effort to help people snap out of that headspace, right? I mean, it takes time to really kind of ease them into this idea that actually you are being exploited, and this is terrifying, and you're going to have to let that wash over you, and and deal with those, that internalized oppression and exploitation, and realize that you're like a victim of some system, but then you got to channel that and make them realize that actually you have an enormous amount of power that you're not currently wielding, and all you have to do is start to do that, and things are going to go much better for you. People think the idea, people take a while to come to terms with that, I've realized, not because the idea is preposterous, all right, that we should be able to live in the city where we work amongst the people that we serve, but because it somehow feels preposterous. It feels to us millennials like this is normal. This is the world we grew up in. Nobody at my age ever turned on the TV, I'm 34, and saw anything inspirational about labor organizers doing anything great. It fucking sucks, right? I mean, it's a really terrible time to grow up if you're going to then become a labor organizer like myself. It's real disheartening. So the third thing is I've just come to realize it's really all about just helping people realize their own power, right? As individuals, you're easily replaced by management. That's just the reality. But they absolutely can't replace all of us. So we absolutely have the upper hand if we stand together. And so if you let people realize that and you just say to them, hey, I'm going to do this. Are you going to stand next to me? Are you going to stand next to us? Me and the other people that we're going to go out here and do this. And we're going to say no. We want better health care. We want to be paid enough to afford to live in the city where we live, where the CEO of the nonprofit blood center where we work is paid $1.3 million. Yeah, I mean, it's about helping people realize that they've got power and that they've got something to be pissed off about. And anyway, that's just what I've been thinking about today. Thanks for having me here. Wait, I'm so sorry. Thank you for the applause. But I did also want to plug the Workplace Organizing Committee, which is honestly how I started getting to do this, right? The DSA's Workplace Organizing Committee, 7 o'clock at the All Pilgrims Church on Capitol Hill. It's just so inspiring to see other people. I mean, people like me, people like the postdocs and the home care workers. This is awesome. There is a community of people who are actively building power in their workplace. And you should be one of them. Come and join us. Thank you.
Thank you, Shaun. Once again, if you're interested in getting involved with the Workplace Organizing Collective, they meet every Wednesday at 7 p.m. at All Pilgrims Church on Capitol Hill on Broadway. So our next speaker is Day. Day is an organizer with the Seattle People's Party, local activist and journalist. He's been doing a lot of really important work at the forefront of documenting the brutality of the city's ongoing sweeps of encampments. So welcome, Day.
I told Shaun I'll only do this if I get to talk about Drake and Pusha T first. Breaking down the drama going on. Actually, that was just a test to see if socialists follow pop culture. And I'm glad that you do, because we need a break sometimes. Yeah, there's a lot going on in the city, and I don't know if anyone else is pretty tired. I'm sitting in these chairs, and I think one of the speakers earlier mentioned some of the numbers and how daunting it can be, especially for young people, when we think about the stats and we think about the condition that our city is in and our county is in. The one night count just got released, and I knew the numbers were going to be bad. But it's numbers like that no matter how much you're prepared for, and we shouldn't be surprised. It's so when we're faced with that reality, we quickly realize that this crisis isn't getting any better. Some of the numbers, as mentioned earlier, we have 12,112 counted homeless folks in our county. About 6,320 of them are unsheltered, which is almost 1,000 more unsheltered than we had last year. And anyone volunteered for that one night count in here? Anyone? Okay, so I can talk a little crap about it. I'm just kidding. No, I think it's a really important work that it gets done, but as you know, I'm sure not all houseless, unsheltered folks were able to get counted, especially during the winter months. And I personally think it's a strategic move for our city to do that count during the coldest months, where a lot of people are really trying to do anything to survive out there. Some more numbers through some public records requests. Shout out to Guy over there who got these numbers for us. But, Seattle police averages about $150,000 in salary a year to be on the navigation team to destroy these encampments, or as we call them, homeless sweeps. 191 of these sweeps officially got counted last year in 2017. An average sweep cost around between $53,000 and $54,000 each time they remove an encampment. I was at Ravenna Woods this past, I can't even keep track. Ravenna Woods got swept, April. April was the 6th time Ravenna Woods got swept, and as the numbers show, that means the city spent $53,000 each time going over there, destroying the encampment, and just waiting for individuals to get tired of the process enough to stop coming back. Yeah, actually, I don't know what you said. Oh yeah, where are they going to go? It's one of those things where, I do want to highlight something though before I introduce Shaun. I went to Ravenna Woods sometime beginning of the summer last year, and at this time there were about a couple dozen people using Ravenna Woods encampment for food. A little bit before that, and during the winter months, there's a source of heat over there. And it was a community that protected each other. There was leadership there. There was accountability. They even had a cleanup system. They had an electricity source, which the city says that they stole. But I met the homeowner next to Ravenna Woods, and actually he was providing electricity to this encampment, proving that not all homeowners think the same. And I bring up that number, I bring up that number because when Shaun showed up with myself, DSA, Socialist Alternative People's Party, we showed up to Ravenna Woods. At that time, there was about 3 or 4 people using the encampment left. I tweeted something today, and I tweet a lot, and I have to take a break from my phone and talk to real people sometimes. But I tweeted today that homelessness is not colorblind. And as somebody who's been at Ravenna Woods multiple times and covered their encampment and covered their sweeps, it's safe to say the majority of the people using that encampment were black and brown people. And as the polls started going up, as SPD presence started to increase, side fun fact, Seattle Parks has a technology system where they monitor and count people using their parks 24/7. And one of the main reasons why they have that technology in there is to see how many homeless people use their parks to gather information so they can go. And we literally get counted every time we go into a Seattle park. Some technologies, even in Seattle Parks furniture, where they track your IPS on your phone. No coincidence, a couple months before that, there was a big initiative to give homeless people free cell phones. And so, things like that, the city knows exactly how bad the problem is, even without doing a one-night count. And, it broke my heart because when it got posted and I'm trying to see the good side of the navigation team, there are social workers that I respect, there are people who actually care about the crisis. By the time the sweep actually happened, a lot of the black and brown folks were already gone. Some of them arrested. I was able to get some police footage showing a harassment towards a black gentleman at the Ravenna Woods encampment and constantly badgering him, asking him if he had any warrants. And the cop actually told him, I bet you have a warrant. It's probably for DV or something. And this type of profiling happens all the time, even within homeless communities. And I bring all that up because I want us activists, socialists, organizers to remember that representation matters. I think oftentimes in oftentimes in our conversations about social justice and social change, we forget about equity and we forget about the people that aren't seen. There's some empty chairs in this room, and I want you to imagine them being filled with black and brown people, filled with people with disabilities, people filled with our Muslim neighbors, etc., and people who are more impacted than even the people we're talking about in our conversations. It broke my heart because I was at this encampment, and man, it sucked because I really wished, as bad as the sweeps were, that these black and brown individuals suffering homelessness got to at least get the little resources the city was trying to provide. And by the time that the sweep actually happened, they were gone, out of sight, out of mind. There's a UW Family Research Center that takes in homeless families, and 60 to 70% of their intake is black families, when the percentage of King County black people is just at 7%. In Seattle, it's under 2%. And so when I look out on the street, I don't necessarily see the large encampments being filled recently with black and brown people. But why is that the case when most of our homeless are black and brown? Where are they? And these are the type of questions that I challenge all of us to ask ourselves. Even with our good intentions, even with our heart's in the right place. And I recognize a lot of people in here, and I've been on the front lines with many of you fighting against fascism and capitalism. I want us to continue to ask ourselves, as we have conversations to think of solutions of affordable housing, to build shelters, are we thinking about the most impacted? When we pass policies, as progressive as they may seem to us, if we're not fighting for the most impacted, a policy that may seem progressive to some is regressive to others. And if that type of policy passes, it's going to take even longer for black and brown, for disabled folks, for QT-POC folks to really get the equity and resources and reparations they deserve. And so, I'm not up here trying to give y'all a guilt trip, but I'm up here to celebrate the victories we've had so far, but to also keep in mind that we need to keep pushing and pushing and pushing. And Shaun is somebody that, one of the most brilliant people I know, definitely, and somebody that I've organized with over and over again, and who I trust because I know that there is value to lived experience, there is value to representation. And Shaun being a brilliant black writer matters. Him being a socialist matters, him being a scholar matters, but him being a black man matters. And so, Shaun, he did write some things for me to say, so I have to say them. Shaun, writer, filmmaker, In 2016, he spearheaded the Seattle Mural Office of Arts and Culture Affairs outreach process. He's one of the ones who turned King Street Station into the cultural hub it is today. I recently saw a exhibit there, and to be honest, until I saw these notes, I had no idea you were part of that. So thank you for that, Shaun. He was a delegate to Bernie Sanders, Uncle Bernie. He was a field organizer for housing activist John Grant, who spoke today in the Position 8 race, and he's currently a field organizer for Pramila Jayapal. Shaun is a member of the internal organizing committee for Seattle chapter of the DSA, and he most recently wrote a book. Every time I get a chance, that book is always in my bag. Shaun knows this. I show it off to people all the time, and I say, that's who wrote it. That's who wrote it. He wrote the most generic message in my book. I thought it was going to be personal, love notes, some emojis, but not that millennial, I guess. The book is called Millennials and the Moments That Made Us, A Cultural History of the U.S. from 1982 to Present. Really, Shaun is brilliant, and Shaun is someone that is going to be organizing for the people for a long time here in Seattle, and somebody that I'm always going to get behind, because you can't fabricate trust. You can't fabricate lived experience. So let's welcome Shaun.
Thanks for that introduction, Day. I promise not to burden anybody here with my Uncle Bernie impersonation. Day knows that it's not very good. I actually want to take a second to just say thanks to all of our comrades in UAW 4121 and Working Washington for making it out. I think there are so many unions and other institutions in town that have a don't rock the boat sort of approach to organizing and to standing up for the people. I think I appreciate institutions and unions that still have a healthy taste for antagonism as a way of achieving political gain. So I'm going to give them a round of applause. I want to also say thank you to Kaylin Nicholson of Socialist Alternative for speaking tonight. I think at a point in time in the mid-2000s when a lot of people were sort of content with the pace of change that was happening in the Obama years, that Socialist Alternative was still holding the proverbial red flag high, and as a result we have a $15 hour minimum wage as a result of a coalition that they did a lot to spearhead, and hopefully we'll be able to, hopefully we'll be able to, the next time we have this event for Red May next year, talk about all the work that we did to hold on to the EHT. Also want to say thanks to all my comrades in Socialist in the Democratic Socialists of America, the Seattle chapter. I think that you have to, when you talk about the recent rise of socialism's visibility, and you write that history at any point, 6 months out, a year out, 10 months out, you have to mention us and you have to talk about us. And so at a point in time where I feel like intersectionality is a word that is much co-opted in the nonprofit sector, even in corporate America, that we're doing a lot of work in the Seattle chapter of DSA to reintroduce that concept to its radical roots as something that is very much grounded in the struggle for recognition and respect and ultimately ending capitalism. So I'm going to give Seattle DSA a round of applause as well. So I'm gonna try to keep my remarks pretty brief because I think we're running up against time here. We have to get out of here at about 9 o'clock or so. But the subject of millennials, as Catherine brought up earlier, is something that I've been fascinated by for the last 3 or 4 years. And I say, when I often use the word millennials, I talk about us because I am one, despite Day's insistence to the contrary. I'm an old millennial as far as millennials go, at 33 years old. And so my birthday was actually on November 8th, 1984, which was a couple of days after Americans looked at what Ronald Reagan had to offer in his first term as president, a first term that was filled with union busting, with massive deregulation of our financial institutions, and a general sort of importation of the same kinds of austerity measures that we were seeing take place in Britain. And Americans said, let's do that again. And so I feel like the sort of, the topic of millennials and I guess what our inheritance is not something that I think of as remote or distant or even an academic matter, but I feel like it's something that has a lot to do with my own specific, I guess, personal inheritance as well. My parents were from Jamaica, and so anybody who's familiar with what the history of neoliberalism is, and it's a term that we can sort of get into defining a little bit later, you can't really talk about it without talking about sort of the test drive that it first had in Latin American nations, Caribbean nations, Asia, Africa as well. And so when you talk about the World Bank or the IMF, massive sort of banking institutions that first internationally sort of impressed this condition of debt on nations that Kaylin was talking about, impressing on students decades later, that's a huge part of sort of the story of where we've come from, generationally speaking. But it's not a perspective that you often get when people talk about millennials, and when you read about those kinds of articles that are in the New York Times or in the Wall Street Journal. It's sort of this banal fixation on, who ate the last piece of avocado toast that was in the fridge, or, what industry it is that millennials are killing. But the history of this actually goes back much further, right? People have been parsing over and trying to define and talk about American generations. In 1923, Karl Mannheim, who's not a socialist, but nobody's perfect, he wrote an essay called The Problem of American Generations. Going back even before him, Japanese Americans and their descendants have been naming their generations since they first arrived here. Taking even a step further back, we should acknowledge that we're here on indigenous land, and land that was first possessed by the Duwamish tribe. On the other coast, it was the Iroquois nation that was saying that any political decision that you make should actually take into account how it's going to impact 7 generations down the line. So this problem of American generations, I think, is one that can be very, very shallow if you let it, but it also becomes a pretty useful template to talk about some pretty broad shifts that I think capital has sort of undergone in the last generation or so, as it were. And so, one of there's some important context, I think, when we talk about the subject of tonight's talk as far as millennials and the new working class, or that sort of idea. A lot of the business counter-revolution that Kaylin and other speakers and John have described is something that we first saw, right? It's one of the reasons why we have so many speakers who have come up here and spoken very eloquently have the analytical tools to describe what is going on locally, is because there's a sense in which this is kind of history repeating itself. If we're talking in broad macro terms, it's really, really impossible to tell the story about our particular historical condition without talking about the business counter-revolution that took place in the 1970s. We've all seen the images of the 1960s and of the 1950s as times of great social struggle, and many of those gains were very, very important and core to our identity today. Gains like the Voting Rights Act in 1964, the Fair Housing Act of 1968, the Immigration and Naturalization Act of 1965, all of these sort of legislative victories that would not have been possible if it weren't for the fact that there were radicals in those times pushing the society to be and move faster towards change than they would have on their own. As Kaylin eloquently pointed out, it's not sort of a situation where you have business and labor, as it were, or antagonistic sort of class interests saying, good game, we'll move on to the next one. There was an active chipping away at that process that happened, right? We know as a result of a massive investment of money and intellect in the form of organizations like the Business Roundtable, the Rand Institute, the Brookings Institute. These were, in essence, neoliberal think tanks before many people had the vocabulary to describe them as such. And really their game was, we're going to try to run conservative candidates for dog catcher, for city council, for mayor. We're going to congregate and organize for power in order to chip back and roll back a lot of those gains. And so it's not, and that's an important piece of context, kind of the crowning political achievement, I guess, of that movement in a way that I think is really, really relevant for the millennial condition was the election of Ronald Reagan, right? And so that's something that I think as millennials, it's a frame of reference that a lot of us might not have, because we're sort of fish swimming in that ideological water, but it's important to call attention to exactly how it was we got to that stage. For younger millennials who were born in the 1990s, you're not exempt from this either, right? I think It's important to point out that the Democratic Party in the 1990s expanded the carceral state, expanded deregulation of financial institutions in ways that even Republicans didn't think they would have been able to have they could have gotten away with. And so that story of sort of the business counter-revolution and very much a pro-business logic pervading much of American life, I think, is something that implicates millennials, no matter where you might fall in that age bracket. And so these are, it's an important sort of to walk through a lot of those broad historical strokes, because when we talk about what organizing as socialists looks like locally, that's sort of the context that we're swimming in at this stage. As an age cohort, I think one of the things that makes millennials so fascinating, I think it was Catherine who said earlier that millennials are blacker, browner, in general, poorer than previous generations, and that's quantifiably verifiable as well as it's qualitatively verifiable, right? It's like those things are absolutely true. That if you look back at statistics about, let's say, 12% of the baby boomer generation being defined is non-white, versus at this point in time, I think we're at 40% of millennials, and in another decade or so, we might get to the stage where we're already north of 55%. And so it's interesting to me the fact that millennials are really demographically, if you look at our demographic composition, not really, you can't talk about how it was that millennials got to that stage without talking about some of those great mid-century reforms, right? The 1967 Supreme Court decision that finally legalized racial intermarriage, for example, or the Immigration and Naturalization Act of 1965, at the same time that millennials have never really known anything but sort of this neoliberal context. We're also very much the product of those mid-century social reforms. And so it's no mistake that a lot of the rhetoric that you hear about millennials sounds strangely similar to the things that people have always said about people of color en masse, right? Like this sort of idea that millennials don't know the value of hard work, are always looking for handouts, very much a logic of austerity that I think has gotten people to the stage where they're more likely to accept the idea that there's not supposed to be a social safety net to help you out if you fall on hard times at all. Housing is supposed to be unaffordable. Healthcare is supposed to be a pain. Education is supposed to be something that is out of reach, and if you do get there, you're going to be saddled with massive debt. The logic there's a certain cultural logic that I try to write about in my book and describe sort of this way in which before people even see a lot of the political ramifications of the unabashed capitalist class sort of expressing itself politically, we first sort of get that culturally. We get that through, a million different messages in music and books and television that sort of tell us that if you're struggling, you're more or less on your own. And so I don't think that it's coincidental that a lot of this framing of the millennial generation is happening to a generation that is in general going to be more black and more brown in general, because these are the kinds of ways that people have judged and sort of parsed through groups that have a grievance claim against capitalism in general. It's something that is said often, a way of delegitimizing political claims to individualize certain issues rather than to structuralize them. So I think that's important context to think about when we talk about why it is that there are so many outrageous sort of takes that are floating out there about the millennial generation, and it's sort of very much a function of a very long-running bias that I think, and long-running forms of institutional despoiling, frankly, that have happened to people of color over time. And so it's amazing, I guess, to sort of look at these things in very, very broad strokes, but one of the things that a lot of the speakers here have done a great job of is localize a lot of those fights. So when we talk about what generational antagonism or conflict looks like locally, I think it's very much still wrapped up in a certain class antagonism that is often elided by the focus on generations. There was a great piece that was written, it had a great title, it was pretty subtle. I think the title of the article in the Huffington Post was Millennials Are Economically Screwed, which leaves a lot to the imagination. And the writer Michael Hobbs sort of makes this point that if you look at the way that sort of in general older groups in the city sort of act and behave politically, many are what we would define as baby boomers, folks who have had the privilege or the opportunity to purchase property as a result of a massive investment in affordable education, in affordable housing, full employment that was made in generations earlier. And so many of those same baby boomers, or many of those same members of that age cohort, are to a stage now where they've conveniently forgotten the fact that they came up in an era where there was full employment. Social Security was something that was guaranteed, and you were offered more or less a social safety net in exchange for risking your life for a couple of years in the military, and are sort of in a situation where any attempt to really sort of reclaim the public commons or public resources for public good is seen as one form of complaining or one form of outrage or another. And so that's very much a fight that I think is being waged along ageist lines, but it's also the case that there are many millennials that are not sort of exempt from this logic, right? Many millennials who are the beneficiaries of maybe charter school educations, millennials who sort of grew up in that cultural water that I was talking about before, where they've really never known anything but a pro-business sentiment pervading all aspects of American life, who say, because I was able to benefit, you should also have to do the same thing. And so the battle that we're fighting in many ways is against sort of political decisions that were made before we even got here, but it's also against people that have sort of bought into the logic while they're here or as they are here. And so this is sort of where the topic of generations, and when we talk about it in the context of capitalism, starts to strain, right? You start to see a lot of the seams that there are many, there are, of course, so many activists, there's so many, as socialists, we partake in this tradition that's been handed down to us by people who came from previous generations, and a lot of times the fights that we're fighting are as often people who are in sort of our own age cohort as well. So it's, I think, very, very important to keep in mind when the generational reductionist takes become overwhelming. And so the philosophical question of this, just kind of wrapping up on this point, I think it gets us to a stage where I think when we're talking about organizing as those of us who are on the left and organizing as socialists, the decision that we have to make is basically what kind of social movement is it that we're going to attempt to build. Given all of these sort of facts about where millennials are sort of situated in history and what we look like demographically, the fact that we grew up in the shadow of the sexual revolutions of the 60s and 70s, the fact that you can't talk about us without talking about the great civil rights reforms of the mid-century, what we're trying to do to push the envelope is you can't really roll the clock back on those gains. And so a socialism that really doesn't do anything to address sort of specifically the ways in which capitalism has disenfranchised people in very, very specific, tangible ways, I think is ultimately kind of a social project that's going to be doomed to fail in one form or another. When we're talking about the fastest growing, or one of the fastest growing occupations in time at this moment, home caregivers, those are disproportionately millennial and people of color. And so those are concerns that we have to take with us. When we're talking about the working class, if we're using that to sort of abjectly describe the white working class, it's just not going to work. Not only is it not going to work, it's also going to fail, I think, because one of the things that the Democratic Party and I guess liberalism generally has gotten extremely right in the last 40 years is sort of this attention or this attentiveness to representation, but not to redistribution. And in such a way, you sort of get, the conflicting social phenomenon of the first African American president presiding over the largest prison population in human history. You sort of get these strange contradictions that arise from the fact that our prevailing political order, even when it gets as progressive as we think it can get, is oftentimes there are severe limits on what that project is going to do to actually redistribute wealth and resources. And so sort of a socialist project that doesn't do a lot to pay attention to, and not only just pay attention to, but actually center the ways in which capitalism disproportionately has despoiled people of color and women, other sexual minorities as well, is one that I think is going to be very vulnerable to frankly, sabotage from people that are able to sort of parrot that rhetoric of representation without actually caring about enfranchising masses of people of color, or women or others. And so I think I actually kind of feel like taking a question or two, because I feel like we've done a lot of talking and I think also a lot of listening, but we could do a little bit more.